We've now reached presentation 19 in the series where we're looking at the prophecies of Ezekiel. Insights from Ezekiel. Restoring God's presence in the land. As usual, let's just reflect back on where we've been in the previous presentation. We're looking at chapters 40 to 46, which is a strange story, but we've got to remember it's a visionary experience. And like dreams, visions don't always correspond exactly to physical reality, but they carry deep meaning. Ezekiel is carried away in his vision on a guided tour of a new temple building. All the dimensions are shown. It's very similar to the original temple in terms of layout, but it's simply huge. Then he has his vision of God returning to the temple. The vision reverses the departure which Ezekiel saw in chapter 10 in the vision there. Then the central altar is described in the temple, and it is simply enormous, and it's right in the middle of the temple area. After that, the roles of the priests and someone called the prince, not an individual person but the rulers, that's all outlined. In particular, the tasks and responsibilities of this prince laid down, because in the past the ruling classes exploited the people. That is now specifically forbidden. Again, a picture helped us. This huge temple area, thick walls with rooms built into them, pink area, and then the temple itself in the blue. Then the buildings within the temple, a portico, a main hall, and the bit called the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctuary, where originally the Ark of the Covenant was kept before it was destroyed when Nebuchadnezzar and his army rampaged through Jerusalem. And the altar is central in the entire area, showing its central importance. Now the area is so large it couldn't fit on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Now for a vision this doesn't matter, it's the meaning that's carried, not the literalism. And it's not an architectural plan. There are some terms and language used there that are not fully understood. The meaning of words has got lost in the mists of time. It's never designed for that. And it's nothing whatsoever to do with end times. That would have no meaning for the original hearers, no meaning for Ezekiel, no meaning whatsoever, and the language would preclude it. It's given for a purpose. The vision has a meaning. It carries wonderful meaning for those who would hear it and see it. And it was addressed to the exiled leadership who were with Ezekiel in the Babylon area. People from the leadership classes who had been taken and deported in 597 BC, many years before. And the meaning? God was returning to live among his people. Remember, that leadership class saw no future, no hope. The land had been savaged and ravaged and fallen apart. People had been deported all over the place. Temple had been sacked, Jerusalem had burned to the ground, kings had been removed, everything had gone. Humanly, there was no future. But Ezekiel has shown God was going to bring his people back together, back into the land, and he would protect them, look after them, and he was going to return to live among his people. And the picture and the vision is of God entering through the east gate and taking up residence permanently in the inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies. God was coming back to live at the center of the life of his people. That's what the vision is conveying to us. Now we would long for God's presence and power to be shown In our Christian communities across the West today, we get occasional flickerings, but very little sustained. We want this. There are many people longing for this. But there are conditions attached, and this story shows. If God's to come back, there has to be purity and holiness, because God is perfect. There has to be order and discipline. The whole temple was shown to Ezekiel, every measurement given. That leads to spiritual empowerment. God living at the center of the community life of his people. And it enables us to fulfill our destiny. Without that, we can't fulfill our destiny. We're becoming steadily more and more marginalized because we've lost God at the center of our community lives. And it starts when we do that. The altar was central. And the great message of the altar is God is holy and perfect, and we're not. And we've got to do it with his resources. We've set up our religious systems. We call them churches or denominations. That's not the way of Jesus. That's not God's plan. We've got to rethink things. We've got to follow the directions of Jesus. And we have to admit that many things that are going on in our churches today do not follow the directions of Jesus. In some cases, they contradict the directions of Jesus. And we've got to live the lifestyle of Jesus before the watching world. That can only happen when we're spiritually empowered. We're only spiritually empowered when God is living at the center of our community life. We've got to come to him in purity and holiness. Centrality of the altar. Centrality of what Jesus has done for us. There's got to be order and discipline. Everything laid out and organized the way Jesus wants it. Not the way we want it. Not to suit our plans. And the previous presentation, we finished with that. We're longing for this in the West today. It will not happen until we're prepared to start renovating the temple, putting our religious structures right. At the moment, we've squeezed God out. This is all part of the restoration prophecies, which is the long section that concludes the prophecies of Ezekiel. We've seen this picture before. The pattern of the restoration prophecies. We've now reached the last one. God's presence in the land, among his people, with everything put right, things organized. A pattern. The way he wants it. With that in mind, let's move on into chapter 47. Now the problem so often, and this is true for many of the prophetic books, indeed for large chunks of the Bible, we read a section, we rip it out of its context, and then we impose our meaning on it. Chapter 47 follows the previous chapters, and it's part of a sequence of thought, a sequence of revelation given to Ezekiel by God. God's role and status will be restored. God's reputation had been dragged through the mud by the behavior of his people. That will be restored. And he will come as shepherd and as king. King, the ruler. Shepherd, the one who leads us and guides us. He would restore the land to his people. Humanly impossible. History shows it happened. And the reminder, it's God's land. As everything in this universe is. It belongs to God, the Maker. And he would return to the center of his people. And in some ways it's strangely fulfilled when Jesus turned up in the temple and God returned to be the center of his people. Sadly, so many rejected him then. You see, we've got to be prepared to do it his way. And that means we've got to put our structures in order. Let's be practical. The structures of the way we order our church activities and lives. They need to come under the scrutiny of the Holy Spirit. We've got to put our structures right, in line with what He wants, not the way we think is the way it should be run. God does promise to provide and protect His people. Story of Gog and Magog. God's protection is there when others attack us, simply wanted to exploit and take from us what we have. He will meet all our needs. He will protect us. But it's all part of a sequence of thought and a package. That's the goal. That blessings would flow out from God's people to the wider world, and that more people would come to know the wonder of living the Jesus way. That's the purpose. That's the end goal. Now, so many people across the churches of the West are longing for that. But we start with longing for that, and we forget there's a sequence of thought, a sequence of things we've got to do, things we have to put right, things we've got to rethink in order for that ever to happen. Revival, renewal, and outreach will not happen till we put our house in order. His way, not our way. Let's look at the chapter 47, the first 12 verses. The man, that's his tour guide, brought me back to the entrance to the temple, and I saw water coming out under the threshold of the temple towards the east, for the temple faced east. The water was coming down from under the south side of the temple, south of the altar. He then brought me out through the north gate, led me round the outside to the outer gate facing east, and the water was trickling from the south side. As the man went eastward with a measuring line in his hand, he measured off 1,000 cubits, and then led me through the water that was ankle deep. He measured off another 1,000 cubits and led me through water that was knee deep. He measured off another 1,000 and led me through water that was up to the waist. He measured off another 1,000, but now it was a river that I could not cross, because the waters had risen and was deep enough to swim in, a river that no one could cross. He asked me, Son of man, do you see this? Remember, the temple is pictured on the Temple Mount, even though it wouldn't fit the geography of the actual reality. Water coming out from high up, and a river that grows at such a rate with no input or feed-in. It's a vision with meaning. Then he led me back to the bank of the river. When I arrived there, I saw a great number of trees on each side of the river. He said to me, this water flows towards the eastern region and goes down into Arabah, where it enters the Dead Sea. When it empties into the sea, the salty water there becomes fresh. Swarms of living creatures will live wherever the river flows. There'll be large numbers of fish, because this water flows there and makes the salt water fresh. So where the river flows, everything will live. Fishermen will stand along the shore from En-gedi to En-eglaim. There will be places for spreading nets. The fish will be of many kinds, like the fish of the Mediterranean Sea. But the swamps and the marshes will not become fresh. They'll be left for salt. Fruit trees of all kinds will grow on both banks of the river. Their leaves will not wither, nor will their fruit fall. Every month they will bear fruit, because the water from the sanctuary flows to them. Their fruit will serve for food, and their leaves for healing. In terms of the way biology works, an impossibility. But it's a vision with spiritual meaning. Just to get the impact of the growth of this, it's a trickle coming out from the south side of the temple area and then travelling east. 1,000 cubits is about 1,700 feet. Now ankle deep. Another 1,000 it's knee deep. Another 1,000 it's waist deep. Another 1,000 it's an uncrossable river. physically impossible, but it's a vision carrying wonderful and deep meaning. And the water from that river is fresh. It generates extensive luxuriant plant life and animal life. Spiritual meaning. Now we have to recognize it's geographically impossible, because the water would have to flow uphill a little bit before it reaches the valley that goes down to the Jordan and Dead Sea, which are below sea level. It's quite a drop, but it has to go uphill before downhill. This doesn't matter. We're not talking about the land shape being changed or some miracle like that. It's a vision carrying meaning. And we looked at the idea of visions that so often Ezekiel had. A vivid, enacted picture. Enacted prophecy rather than verbal prophecy. Oh, we have so much to learn today to bring back the visual into our community church life and to stop our dependence on listening to people talking. It carries deep meaning. Now we can see this story in a kind of context of stories similar to it or carrying a similar theme. If you go back to Genesis itself, water there brings life, flows from the presence of God. The water flowed from the temple area. Joel was writing somewhere around about 520, 500 BC. Now the temple and Jerusalem were sacked in 586 BC. So the people are now beginning to be back in the land, beginning to rebuild. It's a restoration picture. In that day the mountains will drip new wine, the hills will flow with milk, all the ravines of Judah will run with water, a fountain will flow out of the Lord's house and will water the valley of acacias. Biologically and geologically impossible. Wonderful poetry, carrying deep meaning. As God's people were restored and God came back to the center of the community life of his people, life, hope would reach out to the world. From this, the Lord's house, where his presence is. Glorious and wonderful picture. Zechariah, late 6th or early 5th century BC. Not dissimilar time to Joel, maybe a fraction later. On that day living water will flow out from Jerusalem, half of it east to the Dead Sea, half of it west to the Mediterranean Sea, in summer and in winter. Not literal, it's a beautiful, vivid, poetic picture. See, the worshipping centre of God's people, where God's presence is, God at the centre of the life of his people. It releases refreshment all around, east and west, both directions. All the time, summer and winter. Jesus picks up the same imagery. Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said, I wonder if he was referring back to these passages. Rivers of living water will flow from within them. This brings it right back to us as individuals and as a community. See, the Holy Spirit is the source of refreshing life. It's not just for us. It's flowing from within them to benefit those around. Same picture. And in Revelation, and the angel showed me the river of the water of life as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God. Same picture. Flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb down the middle of the great street of the city. Now, water doesn't really normally flow down the middle of the great street. It's a vision God at the center of the life of his community, life-giving, flowing of blessing to all around. So often these little bits are ripped out of context and we impose all sorts of westernized meanings on them, often related to end times. We get it wrong. We've got to interpret these prophetic and vivid pictures in the context, when they were said, to whom they were said, and why. What was the meaning the original hearers would have got? This carries deep meaning, and the picture Ezekiel has fits into this picture. Perhaps it's the longest and most complete one. Spiritual life, hope for humanity, comes from God, and God channels that out from the center of the community of his people. And it reaches out to bless others. The life-giving power that emerges from the house of Yahweh, Yahweh the God of the people of Judah. God at the center of the community of his people. We're not going to bless other people until God is back at the center of our community life. And God will not be back at the center of our community life until we put things right. If you're like, we've got to put our temple structures in order. But it generates an ever-expanding flow of blessing to all around. Books have been written and stories are passed around where little groups of God's people in specific areas have grasped this, put their house in order, and found the power of God as God's at the center of their community life. And so many people round about have been blessed and helped. The kingdom has grown, and it spins out. We want more of this in the West, and it can only happen if God's at the center of his people. We've got to dethrone our rituals and religious systems in our churches of all denominations and allow God to take up his rightful place at the center. To do it the Jesus way. You see, the message for the people, the leadership classes to whom Ezekiel was working in the Babylon area, the temple structures had to be renovated. And the leadership function activities had to be restored, had to be put right. They'd gone badly adrift in the latter days of the people of Judah. God then could live at the center of the community life of his people, and their life would revolve around him. And that would lead to an ever-expanding flow of blessings to all around. That's the picture Ezekiel is bringing, and this picture of the water is the green part, the last part. We long for it, but it's a sequence of thought. God is revealing to Ezekiel the sequence of things that have to be done. We want the last part, but we've got to go through the others first. Let me just suggest our church structures have got to be renovated. How we organize things, what we do. Our leadership function has got to be radically overhauled. Look at our leadership structures across all denominations. Compare it to the leadership model that Jesus gave. There's a huge gulf. We've got to put things right. We've got to allow God to be at the center of our community life. At the moment, we're worshipping what we do, or we're even worshipping our buildings or our denominational structures. We've got to get God back at the center. But that means we've got to start by saying we've got things wrong, we've got to put church structures right, and we've got to put leadership structures and functions right. That's the bit we want, but you see it's a sequence. You won't get the last bit, which is what we want, till we put things right. There is no instant magical solution to bringing revival to the Church of the West. It starts with the hard graft of being in exile, recognizing we've got things wrong, and being willing to rethink things and follow the way of Jesus properly. And what we want and what we long for then can happen. Two things that are emphasized in Ezekiel's vision. Get all the structures in place. He measured everything. Get the leadership roles and functions correct. Now, the leadership roles and functions of today's community of God's people are very different from those of the days of Ezekiel. We live in the time after Jesus has come, but we also live in a very different culture. We've got to put right and get the principles that Jesus laid down worked through in our community life. Then God will return to the center of the community of his people. And God will not return because he can't return, because we've got other things at the center. We've got our church structures. We've got our denominational leadership structures. We've got the way we do things. That's at the center at the moment. They've got to be dethroned. We have good things, we have not so good things. But it's got to be God things at the center. The book of Ezekiel finishes with this great triumphant picture. And the name of the city, that's the place of the people of God. Community of the people of God. The name of the city from that time on will be, the Lord is there. Oh, how we long for that. For God to show up and God be there and be seen to be there. In power and majesty, but in transformed lives and beautiful living. The Lord is there. It involves correcting the sacrificial system. That was the picture Ezekiel was given in the pre-Jesus days. If you're like, we've got to get Jesus back to the center of the frame. Correct boundaries for God's people. It lays out where the people and the tribes were to stay. We'll look at that in a moment. And the land allocations, the way it's organized. We'll look at that in a moment. Because that's the goal. Harmonious, God-centered living. And we've got to admit it at the moment. We're not there. We're nowhere near there. And that will be the outcome. And that remarkable sentence, stated 3 times. I, that's God, I will be proved holy through them in the sight of many nations. God's reputation will be demonstrated through his people before the eyes of the watching world. Oh, we long for that. We long that blessings will come, that the transformation that Jesus can bring will be spilling out wider through our communities. There's a sequence of thought, and Ezekiel has here the correct message, vividly portrayed in this vision, that will lead us to the way of revival. There are no magic answers. We can't rip bits of it out of context. It's a total package. It's God's vision. Now chapter 47 goes on, and we're going to look at this, the correct boundaries and the land allocations. The various tribal allocations and the boundaries of Jerusalem. And before we go into this, let us remind ourselves yet again, it's a vision. It does not fit the geography of the land. And in many ways it's not practical. But it's a vision carrying meaning. If we start ripping sentences out of context and interpret them literalistically, we'll end up tying ourselves up in impossible knots. And we become a laughingstock before the eyes of the watching world, rather than bringing life and hope to the watching world. I pick out a little bit here. You are to distribute this land among yourselves according to the tribes of Israel. They're going back into the land. You are to allot it as an inheritance for yourselves and for the foreigners residing among you to have children. In other words, people who've stayed there. They're not just passing through. You are to consider them, that's the foreigners, as native-born Israelites. Along with you they are to be allotted an inheritance among the tribes of Israel. That's land entitlement. In whatever tribe a foreigner resides, there you are to give them their inheritance, declares the sovereign Lord. Too dangerous, again, to rip things out of context. The land division was not ethnic. God is the God of all humanity. He has no favorites. Too often, people take the bits of Joshua, rip them out of context, interpret them literalistically, and end up with ethnic cleansing. And before the eyes of the watching world, that's rejected, rightly so. It's not ethnic cleansing under Joshua. We only have to look at it. There's a series of Joshua online. It's not ethnic cleansing, never was. This is inclusive. Tragically, by the time of the days of Jesus, this principle was lost, and the Jewish leadership of that day saw themselves as a superior class, and they described all those who were non-Jews as Gentiles and looked down on them. They were second-class citizens. And today, the principle is ignored widely. Where Arabs living in the Middle East, in the West Bank area, throughout the area of Israel-Palestine, who have got legal documents of land rights that go back into history, these are just ignored. Their land is taken, their houses bulldozed, they're driven out. Worth pondering. The vision of Ezekiel, the instructions given, are big, wide, inclusive. Now, here's an attempt to get some idea of what the description says. The way it's designed is it describes them as kind of strips going from east to west, west to east, down through the land. One thing that stands out is that the land belongs to God and He remains sovereign Lord of the land. There is no permanent entitlement to the land. That's true of everything in life. We came with nothing, we shall leave with nothing, as someone said. Now there's some features. 12 tribes, Levi doesn't get land space. And to get back to the 12, Joseph is divided into two, his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And that's the pattern that happened under Joshua and Moses. Now, the geographical dividing up of the land pays little attention to reality. It's east to west in strips, and it pays no attention to topography. It's a vision, it's a picture conveying principle. Yes, there's tribal equality, but if everything's centered in the temple, if you're far to the north or far to the south, distance undermines this. Again, the principle is there, not their geographical reality. But it's interesting to note that the sons of the main wives of Israel, named after the tribes named after them, are closer to the center. The land area is divided into horizontal strips. The allocations don't match what actually happened under Joshua in the past. But let's remember, Ezekiel was in Babylon. He would have no maps. The idea of a map scarcely existed. And indeed 10 of the 12 tribes had simply vanished under the Assyrians, scattered throughout the Assyrian area. God would bring many of them back. But they'd vanished long before the lifespan of Ezekiel. You see, it's diagrammatic, it's not reality. And if you look at it, it's all related to what I've called this reserved area in the middle. Now, there's no evidence that this model was ever implemented because it's not designed as some sort of geographical plan. It's designed to convey a spiritual meaning, as so often is the case with Ezekiel. Let's look at this reserved area. A strip across the land. The 12 tribes are built around it. This strip is 13 kilometers wide. Again, no evidence this ever existed as described here. It's symbolically emphasizing things. The temple is central to the life of God's people. The place and function of the leadership needs looked at. And organizational leadership needs looked at. It's all laid down. If God's people are to function the way God wants them to function, to make God known by their quality lifestyle to the wider world around, then all this has got to be put in order. Bordering the territory of Judah from east to west will be the portion you are to present as a special gift. The land given by God to the people, they give back part of the land to God, dedicated to Him. Be 25,000 cubits wide, that's the 13 kilometers. Its length from east to west will be equal one of the tribal portions. They were all in strips. The sanctuary will be at the center of it. The special portion you are to offer the Lord will be 25,000 cubits long, 10,000 cubits wide. This will be the sacred portion for the priests. In the center will be the sanctuary of the Lord. This will be for the consecrated priests, the Zadokites, who were faithful in serving me and did not go astray as the Levites did when the Israelites went astray. Be a special gift to them from the sacred portion of the land, a most holy portion bordering the territory of the Levites. Alongside the territory of the Levites will be territory of the priests, the Levites will be allocated a portion of land 25,000 cubits long and 10,000 cubits wide. They must not sell or exchange any of it. This is the best of the land and must not pass into other hands, because it is holy to the Lord. The remaining area will be for the common use of the city, for houses and for pasture land. The city will be the center of it. Its produce will supply food for the workers of the city. The workers from the city who farm it will come from all the tribes of Israel. What remains on both sides of the area farmed by the sacred portion of the property in the city will belong to the prince. Both these areas around the length of the tribal portion will belong to the prince, and the sacred portion with the temple sanctuary will be the center of them. So the property of the Levites and the property of the city will lie at the center of the area that belongs to the prince. The area belonging to the prince will lie between the border of Judah and the border of Benjamin. Now you read that and just blow your mind. How can we take it all in? Difficult to imagine. It's not related to geographical reality because it relates to spiritual realities. That's why it's important not to interpret it literalistically. But as always, diagrams do help us to see the spiritual realities. Here's my attempt at giving a diagram. This strip of land, and it goes on to the west and on to the east, left and right. Tribal allocation of Judah to the north, tribal allocation to Benjamin to the south. Land was allocated to the ruling class, the prince. The word prince carries the idea of rulership rather than the status of a king. The temple is central. Priests work there. The Levites are supporting them, and they've got land and provision there. And the city with open areas each side for agriculture. Now that's the diagrammatic picture, roughly with the dimensions correct as is in the description. But it's not literal, it's spiritual. It carries spiritual meaning. Let's look at that a bit further. That's the key point. God has returned to live at the center of his people. That's why the temple is central. That symbolizes that. So things are built around it. And those who serve at the temple are close. Those who organize the nation are close. And then the people spread out beyond that. See, everything's put in order. The order is strange to us with our Western logical mindsets. It's a vivid vision, it's a picture. It's not physical reality, it's spiritual reality. God is at the center. And the religious system is now centered on God, not the systems that they'd set up or that we set up today. And the life of the people is centered on God. Looking at the passage, this becomes very clear. And it's equality of access, physically and spiritually. Yes, priests and Levites, they have a specific function in order to make it possible for equality to run. They are not a superior class. The prince is bounded within the land given to him and not to take any more. See, the prince, the secular rulers have their place. We need organization. It has always been true. Any community needs things to be decided and put together and organized. But that is explicitly ruled out. Exploitation was the normal pattern of things before the fall of Jerusalem, and it got worse over the centuries. Isaiah pictured it. Then Jeremiah pictured it. Ezekiel saw it. And the ordinary people were suffering terribly. That must stop. There is no superiority complex. Ruling classes, religious ruling classes, cease to exist. Those who organize and rule, those who lead the religious side, they serve the led. And they are not a superior group. It all comes to a glorious climax. The book finishes with that. The name of the city, that's the city of the community of the people of God. The Lord is there. God's at the center of the community of his people. You see, in the whole vision, Ezekiel saw the people restored to the land, secure and protected. But that was only going to happen if conditions were fulfilled. And the vision conveys that. And it's conveying it to the leadership classes to whom Ezekiel was speaking in the Babylon area. You see, we forget about the conditions. We've got to put that right. That was true in Ezekiel's day, true today. We've got to put that right. Our leadership structures across all churches bear little relation to what the New Testament presents. And that picture has got to be re-established. We try to avoid it, but it's there all the time. Now the life of the community of God's people can follow God's directions if these things don't hinder us. Too often structures hinder us, leadership hinder us. We need to release God to be the center of our community life. In practical terms, let's get back and follow the directions of Jesus. That means we've got to come with an open mind to what he said, what he did, and how he did it. And together, we've got to live the lifestyle of Jesus. We are his hands and his feet before the watching world. That can only happen with God at the center. Jesus is Lord. But Jesus is only Lord when we obey him, as he himself pointed out so clearly. And that's the outcome. When the Lord is there, when God's at the center of our community life, of his people, then and today, together, we make an attractive, positive impact on the watching world. What a message Ezekiel brings, the challenge he brought to the leadership classes of his day, the challenge and the vision he can bring to us, particularly in the Western Church today. We finished the book, but I'm going to try in the last presentation just to look at the book as a whole, to bring out the key messages that Ezekiel had then and has today for us.